or for our progressive socio-economic investment institute is education. And in education, we focus on organizing various webinars touching on topics from social to economic to politics. We focus on various topics that cut across. Colleagues will all know that there is something called Africa Trade Areas. Colleagues will know that it was established to ensure that there is trade between African countries. But the question remains, is there any guarantee that the natives will participate actively in this African continental free trade? That is the question that we need to grapple with tonight. Tonight, we are very fortunate that amongst us, we have one of the speakers experienced around this topic. Our speaker is a professor, is a professional associate of infrastructure development and engagement unit at Nelson Mandela University. Our speaker, like I said, is a professional associate of infrastructure development and engagement unit at Nelson Mandela University. He graduated in electrical and industrial engineering management advancement programs. And he also holds a Master's of Business Administration. He's a candidate doctor of business leadership at the Graduate School of Business Leadership at UNISA, pursuing a research topic, an innovative project finance model for infrastructure development in Africa, a case for SADC railway system. He's registered with the Engineering Council of South Africa and the South African Institute of Electrical Engineers. Colleagues, he is also a part-time lecturer at Nelson Mandela Business School and a fellow of the Institute of Nigeria-China Development Studies at the University of Lagos. We are so humbled as a progressive socio-economic investment institute to have Bongani Mankewu as our presenter tonight. Without a waste of time, we'll hand over to Mr. Bongani Mankewu. Over to you, Bongani.
Thanks, Sediko. Thanks a lot. Greetings to all the colleagues that are part of this discussion. I hope I'm audible. It's quite a complicated and complex task that the Institute, championed by Sediko, requested me to come and share with you. However, I think the whole learning, it should be a twofold. I will learn from you, you learn from me. I will try by all means to make it concise and precise. You already introduced me. What I will be discussing with you, as you will see, the African Continental Trade Area, subsequent from the recent agreement that has been signed, it talks about creating one African market. I will try and share my thoughts around this complex topic with an outline where I have to give a historical perspective of the economic partnership agreement that has happened post-colonial system in the African continent. Then I'll try and run through the actual African free trade area subsequently from the agreement. And I'll move on further to deal with institutionalization. That is very fundamental, as all the time we will find situations where our institutions found wanting. As a result, the investment it comes at a price, and then move further to the development of which how to build value chains. Understandable that if you are to trade, there should be something of value add that you add in the actual development of the economy and actually the native structure. And therefore, I'll conclude. Colleagues, the founders of the African continent, let me try and make this. The founders of the African continent envisaged an Africa evolving from liberation, that is independence, through development and on to the African unity. The founders of the African continent, that's what they envisaged. If I were to put this in a practical sense, a liberation moving to sort of a trade, but in an African context, a development. Therefore, we can be united on something. I put the quote there by Franklin, where he goes on to say the freedom to move capital in and out of the country at will is a freedom that some exercise at enormous cost to others. There's a dichotomy on these two phrases. I will try and zoom in both of them. One, I must make a disclaimer that what I'll be presenting in here are my thoughts, of course. These thoughts are not taken from nowhere. This is a literature that I've went through and then I've abridged it for the purpose of this conversation with you colleagues. It's an abridged a facilitation that tries not to focus on scholarly research, but is taken from literature. It doesn't really have a methodological approach in terms of the actual findings, as you will see as we conclude. These are the views that I want to share with you. You already mentioned that I'm an associate at Nelson Mandela University and of course a fellow at University of Lagos. The views expressed here are my views. Now, the historical background or the historical perspective of the economic partnership agreements date back. I were to try and zoom in on the politics of trade, but we have limitations because I have limited time here. However, we are very much aware there was once upon a time where during a colonial rule and all developments prior to that, slavery, etc., where Europe, particularly Britain, had a deficit, a surplus, a trade surplus of about $35 million. Those are the years between 1816 to 1855. And in 1906 to 1930, just before the World War II, that trade surplus in Britain was about $870 million. So between 1816 and 1835, Britain had a 30 million surplus. 1906 to 1913, Britain had about 870 million surplus. So at a time, there was a time of peace and prosperity in England, if you that is Britain, if you date it back 1815 right up to 1914. So those years were the years that all the Brits are always nostalgic about. So I am not going to go back. Then things evolve up to a point where then there was a movement towards independence by most of the African, Caribbean, and Pacific states. So the European Union and its former incarnation, that is the European Economic Community, and the African, Caribbean, and Pacific states date back to the 1957 Treaty of Rome. So I started there, of which the Treaty of Rome was established. It established the European Common Market and made provisions for the creation of the European development funds. They're understanding that these colonial countries, as they move out, there should be a need, or there's going to be a need for some kind of a fund to pursue or continue the development. So these economic development funds were created to provide technical and financial aid to colonies of the European states. That is those in the African, Caribbean, and Pacific. Now, that's the historical imperative of the developments that happened right up to Canton Partnership Agreement. If you go the Treaty of Rome, it came up with the European Common Market. You go further and further and further, right up to Canton Partnership Agreement. Now, there was an article 22 of GATT, which establishes the conditions for governing regional agreements. So this provided for an exception for most favored nations. That's where then the problem started. So to date, if you move further, the Canton Agreement hasn't been completely finalized, dating back all the way during the inception of the so-called Industrial Revolution. So on the 27th September 2002, the European Union and the African, Caribbean, Pacific countries officially opened negotiations on the Economic Partnership Agreement in Brussels. By late 2005, negotiations with each of the individual regions have commenced. Out of those discussions, we end up having those 6 regional trades. You call the Caribbean states, the Pacific states, etc. In South Africa, we have now your SADC, etc., etc. Now, I want to go straight to issues of contention. Controversially, the EU's negotiations or negotiating mandate for the Economic Partnership Agreement went beyond what was required initially. It went further now to add some conditions on the initial discussion or sort of a mandate. Now, those were the investment liberalization, the government procurement issues, the competition policy rules. Now, critical to note, I think that's the area that I think I want to put my proposition for this conversation. The structural adjustment program were very fundamental in pushing this investment liberalization, government procurement issues, competition policy rules. You'll recall I talk about most favored nations under the GATT clause 22. As a result, we found ourselves in this spaghetti bowl because each country was negotiating upon itself with the European Union, and some they grouped themselves because the requirement for most of them to be part of the World Trade Organization, it was a matter of they must be in some kind of a free trade area. So we end up having this situation. Now, I didn't deal with the protocols attached to right 1957 today. But now when we get to this Africa Continental Free Trade Area, we're dealing with this spaghetti. And there were those conditions that I've highlighted previously, that of investment liberalization, government procurement issues, competition policy rules. So now the Africa Continental Free Trade Area, reminding back on the architects of the African continent, they envisaged an Africa evolving from liberalization, development, then the African unit. I believe I am talking here in a platform dominantly or influenced by native thoughts. Native thoughts, to an extent, the liberation of the African continent has been fought under the ideology of Pan-Africanism, of which Nkrumah and his Kahoot championed. But they were very clear that it must envisage an Africa evolving from liberation through a political ideology, development, then an African unity. Now, my generation and other people's that are involved here, that are part of this discussion, are battling to connect an ideology with a vehicle to drive development. So therefore, there's prosperity in the African continent. Now, since the Israel discussions, if you look at it, the only instrument to date that tries to look at a tool that I said has been lacking, the development and the African unity, is the attainment of, or getting to a point where we agree on the Africa Continental Free Trade Area. And this instrument, I think, is an instrument that, of course, it is meant to achieve the developmental regionalism, but it is meant to try and reform the market conditions of the African continent. It's possible, of which I know there are other studies where some countries are of the view that when you get involved in this African Continental Free Trade Area, there are some disadvantages as far as, for example, there are studies commissioned in Nigeria where there is a loss of revenue from tariffs. As a result, if they were to be really part of the African Continental Free Trade Area, they will have to come up with a comprehensive consumer tax system to come and recover the loss that they will get from the tariffs revenue. I am not going to get to those technicalities. I want to believe most of us here, we can try and find ways, but the pillars of the African Continental Free Trade Area that leads us to regional developmental regionalism. One is a matter of a fair trade integration. That I believe that the natives, if I'm correct, they need to find ways as to what role should we play in this whole free trade integration. Competition, cooperation on transformative industrialization. Industrialization is a big concept in the African continent because it's got its own advantages in the political elite and it's got its own disadvantages in the broader society. Cooperation on the cross-border infrastructure investment and trade facilitation. Cooperation on democracy, good governance, peace and security. That's basically what are the pillars of the developmental regionalism. Taking you back to this spaghetti spiral that you see. So it gives us an opportunity, therefore, that we can be part of this, be it we call it, we reform it, or we start it from scratch. But it is a powerful instrument that opens up a discussion around the market conditions of the African continent. So the Africa Continental Free Trade Area and industrialization, what I thought with the abridged literature that I look at it, if the native group in the continent intends to, hello?
Good morning.
Okay, can I carry on?
Yes, you can carry on, Bongani. That's
okay. The things that I believe I've already mentioned, that the failure of the Pan-Africanism, the success of the Pan-Africanism is to achieve, to an extent, the liberation of the African or so-called sovereign state in the African continent. But the laziness among those who are coming from the African continent is to think of instruments that will lead us to a real development of the African continent. A development, therefore, that will take us to the real African unit. You can go to all people that talks of the Pan-Africanism. They dwell so much on the ideological character of Pan-Africanism. But we struggle to think and apply our minds to think about how it should address the development. As a result, therefore, we become united. So there are a few things that I want to share with you. If we are to play some kind of a significant role in attaining what the architects of the African continent envisage, that of liberation, development, then African unity. We must focus on quality education system and infrastructure, strong work ethics. Let's stop this native approach of laziness. Let's get involved to real pragmatistic aspect. I want to make a disclaimer again to you that philosophically I'm a pragmatist because my understanding is a conscience that is not applicable anywhere. It escapes from the mind of an individual. So strong work ethics are essential. Mobilization of capital that I'm going to talk about the most in this presentation of mine. Dual logic economy where big business and SMEs cooperate. Outward looking. But when we look outward, we need to start to identify and define ourselves as who we are. Now, the societal characteristics for the task, it's focused excellence. I want to put it very straight. I'm also a native. Comrades, let's stop the mediocre. I mean, the world operates on the basis of excellence. Let's define ourselves as who we are on the basis of we must excel. So a well-developed vision that is very critical in trying to champion our institutions as currency to fund development. Equitable market share, the African Continental Free Trade Area is trying to the idea is to address this equitable market share. We're very much aware of the fact that across the continent, all the 54 countries, 55 countries, including those in diaspora, we don't have equitable market share. So development and research is critical. Sediko, what you're doing already, it tries to address what that says. Research and development. So to develop a unique body of knowledge. So we need to equip ourselves of this reform, if we call it a reform, or if we call it, we rework it. So we need to define a society. We need to define ourselves, our being, who we are. Now I'll go to the next, that is institutionalization. Critical to all the troubles that Africa found itself is one, natives are not part, or natives have opted to outsource the structuring of society to others. Now, if you look at a societal environment, as you see the model that I have in there, I couldn't think of any other way of explaining this than to come up with this. A society is structured by those who live in it. Probably God gave us land, oceans, and all other things, but the behavior of a society is a social construct. I might get people who might question me on that. Now, these institutions that are built, they manage the society. Now, if you look on the tree that I have in the social, the cultural, and the economic capital, not a single family that can strive in a broader society and elsewhere if it doesn't structure its values from its cultural roots. Now, in the context of the African continent, moving away from the colonial ruling, these three that I call them the components of the capital, that I believe they're very much fundamental and of necessity in dealing with mobilization of capital. The mobilization of capital, it's what will make the native to have a seat on the table. We have to find ways on how the society is structured from a social capital, cultural capital, and economic capital so that we can have one meaningful capital. As things stand, with all the things that has happened, our institutions are focused mainly or are built on the edifice of the economic capital. I'm going to share my thoughts on that as I carry on. Now, when we inherit these copy-paste institutions that have been imposed to us, we end up establishing demagogue institutions that we have to manage. Now, these institutions, to a greater extent, they need to be managed by natives. But these natives, they struggle with these institutions because they are against their cultural background. Now, where the problem lies, under these institutions, you have the state power sitting under institutions. Now, where we fail, due to the fact that we are so badly disorganized, we struggle to make a distinction. If now we are going to try and mobilize our capital, we have to make a distinction as to where the power lies. Because in any society, you have a social power, and you have an economic power, and a state power that is a guardian or a vanguard of the state, of all the institutions within the country. Now we have to ask ourselves a question: who subordinates to who in these powers? Is the social power supposed to subordinate to the economic power? Is the state power supposed to subordinate to the economic power? As if you take a case in South Africa, I think we have an experience with the South African circumstances. The economic power is the main power. I want to believe it is the main power across most of the countries in the continent, to an extent that the state power tend to subordinate to the economic power. Now, the real power ordinarily in a continent like Africa is supposed to lie within the social power, but the social power subordinate to the state power and the economic power. This is my proposition. My proposition is the state power subordinate to the social power, the economic power subordinate to the social power, not the other way around. So these are the things that we have to look at in trying to find ways on how we're going to play a significant role in the African continental free trade area. Because the danger out of this, if your institutions have been built from the edifice of an economic power that you don't hold, it makes it impossible for you to navigate these institutions. I want to believe out of these conversations, we can chat about that. We need to have institutions that are established from our cultural power that is mostly associated to the social power. As a result, we dictate the economic power. In mobilization of capital, we therefore need to think of the cultural capital is the pillar of the social capital and the economic capital. Therefore, we can define ourselves as who we are, as we therefore try to design and structure our institution. As things stand, the failure of development in the African continent is the weakness of the institutions. The weakness of institutions leads to all the symptoms that we hear about, the corruption, etc., non-compliance with the democracy, and so forth. So yes, we're gonna dwell a lot on this. I'll try to be brief. Now, when you talk about the actual development, I wanna take you back two successive policy regimes since the Second World War that have temporarily succeeded in reconciling the uncertainties and instabilities of the capitalist economy with democracy's needs for stability for people's lives and the capitalist owns need for a confident mass consumers. The two policy regimes is Keynesian and the neoliberal that tend to be a pure market. Now, post Second World War, when the struggle to contain the colonial ruling these two regimes play a significant role. Initially, democracy was never in marriage with capitalism. The capitalists never viewed democracy as a mass base being able to create wealth. They ever look at it and thought of, no, but masses cannot create wealth. But when they realized that democracy intends to deal with issues of stability that will lead to mass consumption, then democracy today, some of the commentators, they even use it as a synonym to capitalism. So those policy regimes assisted the cause of that marriage. Now, one being a system of public demand management generally, who then control the demand for the stability of the people. The other being a system of markets, unregulated derivatives and markets. Now, if you go back to what I've raised from the historical perspective of the economic partnership agreement, you will see those three that I've highlighted. That talks to the liberalization of the investment liberalization, the government procurement issues, and the competition policy rules. Now, these two regimes, as they evolve, they attempted to address these three critical conditions. That became a critical contention in trying to get to a point of how Africa trade with the European countries. So democracy, as I've already mentioned, it really managed to mobilize people to some sort of stability. But on the other hand, it managed to sustain a capitalist system to come up with a confident mass consumption. So the combination of the two reconciled capitalism's problem, but in a way that eventually proved unsustainable, meaning which the stability through democracy have fed the capitalist system through mass consumption. I will talk about that now. I just want to refer to what happened in Europe when they come up with the Marshall Plan. So the success of the Marshall Plan were on those very few four fundamental. European countries possesses long-standing entrepreneurial heritage, a base for business acumen, high levels of general education, high levels of technological and engineering capabilities. So Marshall Plan, it's assumed might fail in Africa because African countries lack the proper structures to use international financing facilities efficiently. Now, all that points to the fact that if we are unable to engage on a discussion on how we structure our capital from a societal point of view, from who we are point of view, a capital that has got foundations from a cultural capital, supported by a social capital, therefore an economic capital. So we'll always try and copy and paste other people's things. I've already mentioned some of the things there to achieve the social homogeneity, like in the Nordic countries, that has been borrowed in the Nordic countries. The quality education, strong work ethics, mobilization of capital, dual, etc. Now, as I was just citing the historical success of Marshall Plan in Europe. Now, if you deal with this mass production for mass consumption, there's a Fordist model that made democracy to court or to be in courtship with the capitalist system, where the four production technologies sustain profitability of capital. As a result, we end up having a mass production for mass consumption. That's what Croce wrote. Now, when you talk of mass consumption and mass production, the European countries position themselves out of all the instruments that I've mentioned that have been attempted to be built, of which mostly successfully built since 1957. They structure Europe to be an engineering workshop of the African, Caribbean, and Pacific states. Now, when the mass consumption in Europe started to have some uncertainties to a point then that it became a threat to the capitalist system, therefore instability to the democratic project, they had to find ways to outsource the mass consumption. That is why then you will see that spiral, the spaghetti bow. So the policies or the regimes that I've highlighted to, that is of private, that is of public demand from the states, where we have to build infrastructure, we have to feed our people, we have all sorts of things that are required for development. Through those three components that I've mentioned, the investment, liberalization, the procurement, and the competition, through the structural adjustment program of then the early 80s, we end up having a situation where the capital has to be sustained. I mean, the capitalist has to be sustained. Now, for the capitalist system to be sustained, you need to push consumption. Now, for the European countries to push consumption, they had to devise mechanisms that I always refer to the structural adjustment programs to privatize the Keynesianism. And now it's a situation now which is, its key objective was to have a government withdraw from accepting overall responsibility for the economy. Now, that is very dangerous. So when the government withdraw from accepting the overall responsibility for the economy, it's a situation that I have on the previous slide, where now the economic capital dictates on how the institutions of a state should be structured. Once you have that situation, it's got a term, is financialization. So far, African countries, African states are all financialized. They are financialized due to the fact that the institutions we build are very weak. As a result, the economic capital dictates the lives of the African continent. Now, what financialization is, in South Africa, they're very familiar with the concept, because in South Africa, in recent times, we have what we call the state capture. So the state capture in the context of South Africa is a situation where the politics are captured by few elitist individuals in the country. So financialization is the same concept, where the economy of the country is captured by few that plays in that space. So therefore, when you look then at the privatization of the public services, the economy, where the very few that are part of the financialization project, they dictate on how the central banks should operate. They dictate on how the financial institutions should operate. There is no way that the institutions that we have will ever be strong. Now, I challenge the natives that if we were to develop the African continent, of course, with the emergence of the African Continental Free Trade Area, those are the things that we have to challenge unapologetically. Now, two things came together to rescue the neoliberal model from the instability that would otherwise have been its fate. Because now, when the mass consumption, when it gets reduced in Europe, it has to be outsourced. Now, the growth of credit markets for poor and middle income people started to emerge. It didn't end to people, it went on to countries. Now, the credit availed by the European countries US and others that were part of the Western project. It made the privatized Keynesianism to be a success, to continue feeding the capitalist project. And then further on, the second is the derivatives and futures market among the very wealthy. So as you know, is dichotomous, because you have a situation now where you push the developing countries in a situation of credit, but you get those few that really amass wealth out of it. So this privatized arrangement is therefore fundamentally the creation and endurance of financialization. There is therefore a structural link between financialization as a regime of accumulation and financial globalization, besides the financial liberalization. So privatized Keynesianism is in advanced economies does provide a link between the role of developing countries as exporters and as recipients of foreign investment. Now, how then the foreign direct investment, if say we talk foreign direct investment or foreign portfolio investment, how is it structured elsewhere there? So those are the things that we need to engage on, because now it leads us to a situation of a model like this, where you have what they call you optimize financing. So you have a situation on the supply side and you have a situation on the financing side. Remember the three that I've mentioned previously that became a contention, leading us to the spaghetti bowl that are liberalized investment, because that's where things went very wrong. Investment liberalization, government procurement issues, competition policy rules. Now I will probably somehow make sense to you. So when I come up with this slide and say now, those three managed to influence the whole financing setup, relationship between the developing countries and developed countries. Because on one side, on the blue, we're talking consumption. On one side, we're talking the capital that is available. Critical to this is that a 10 billion rand that comes to our national treasury to build railway lines, it comes to South Africa as an investment, because South African fiscals cannot afford railway lines or any form of a mega project. But due to those three, you must liberalize your banking system, including the retail system, because what is important, what pays the bills of our engineering workshop in Europe is consumption, irrespective of people are left with credit, avail reasonable credit. Now, when this 10 billion rand came in here, due to competition policies and government procurement, all this 10 billion rand that is to purchase must be purchased in our engineering workshop in Europe. As a result, we'll end up having white elephant infrastructure projects or incomplete, due to the fact that the purpose was not to build the African continent. The purpose was to take money from Europe to give it to the African countries, for African countries to consume. Now, competition and government procurement play a significant role. Those who build that infrastructure must come from the European engineering workshop. When you do that, you collapse all your manufacturing outlets that we have in the country. South Africa, for example, because South Africa was partly part of the GATT clause 22, that is the most favored nations by the European Union from inception. So you'll find that way before South Africa built a base on the industrialization, where we have factories, etc. But now, as we carry on with this model, you have a situation now when we invest on infrastructure or on any industrial or any form of project that has to do with development, we got money from them, and the money expatriate back to them. And going forward, the parts for those projects are still procured elsewhere in Europe. Then you destroy the whole manufacturing base that we have, or industrial base that we have. Now politicians will come this side and make headlines that we receive money from Europe, 10 billion rand for investment. I mean, we've seen these investment conferences that the president talks of. Remember, I think I didn't say this, those three elements that push us to the spaghetti bowl, they led us to make a confusion between real foreign direct investment and foreign portfolio investment. Because out of surviving on credit, be it human beings and countries, speculations plays a significant role. So politicians will come and say, we managed to arrange an investment of 10 billion rand, and the rand in South Africa peaks. Elsewhere in the continent, the currency peaks. But only not to know that this setup is within the setup of financialization. And all what we're talking about is going to go further. I mean, recently we were in a crisis, but the president gathered a lot of money in about 2 or 3 investment conferences. But we don't see what exactly they do. So the confusion made between foreign direct investment and foreign portfolio investment, foreign portfolio investment that works on speculation. Is the president well? Speculations and foreign portfolio peaks. Is the president weak? Such things. But now this is a model that they use, that is used generally mostly by the economic credit agencies. You will have syndicated funds here, but it's called this optimal financing. So those that are involved in policy development in their countries, those are the things that they need to look at and say, hey, hold on, how this foreign direct investment works as a spillover to the overall economy. Because I think the African countries would prefer a democracy that will sustain itself and also sustain its own consumption. It doesn't prefer a democracy that brings in consumption to sustain others. So if we take from the founders of the African continent, they envisage in Africa evolving from liberation through development and to an African unity. You see now the difference here. Franklin makes it very clear. The freedom to move capital in and out of a country at will is a freedom that some exercise at an enormous cost to others. He said this in his time. Those were the years of the beginning of, or just post World War II, or just the time of World War II. The freedom to move money from here to here and bring it back, if it's done at the will of those, but at the cost of others, is not a problem. Now, can we achieve the development project that Nkrumah envisaged of leading us to the African unity? I therefore say that the African Continental Free Trade Area requires a thoughtful process by the natives, because they're also out of the scheme of things. So far in the continent, we have several agencies that exist. It's upon us to say, do we carry on and find ways to be part of these agencies, or do we contest them and revolutionize them? Now we have African Union that has to deal with the policy and governance in the continent. Is it our original thinking? You have the Economic Commission of Africa that deals with research and development, that sits within the United Nations, that is supposed to deal with research and development, and you have the African Development Bank that's supposed to finance development in the African continent. But sadly, all these institutions operate within the framework that I'm trying to bring it to your attention here, that is structured from the economic perspective. So basically, we have African states and institutions that are structured for consumption of Europe and the US, that to an extent, its value base is economically to balance between the consumption and the production. Now, Africa mustn't produce for the capitalist project to prosper, to try. So you have to impose an economic understanding from a consumption point of view. For us to have our institutions strong and firm, we will have to rethink of institutions that are structured from our values of who we are, that are associated with our societies. Therefore, we can take them to the world and we say, this is how we think our economic structure should be. I want to believe those institutions will be able to eliminate all the idiosyncratic risk that you will always get brought by the financialization. So those are the things that we just have to apply our minds on. For example, if you go to China, they found ways to deal with these things. So you will continue to have what Franklin therefore argued that the freedom to move capital in and out of a country at will is a freedom that some exercise at enormous cost to others. Now, what Nkrumah therefore and his Kahoot thought of that they needed to achieve to envisage an Africa evolving from liberation through development and on an African unity, the development we are not going to achieve. So therefore, the natives have to think of a political platform for an industrial advancement. I want to believe South Africa is lacking in that sphere because South Africa is the last country that attained independence in the African continent. But South Africa failed to learn from others. Instead, they perpetuated the Washington consensus that goes with the structural adjustment program to make sure those three conditions that were highlighted by the cards, that of liberalized investment, government procurement, competition policies. Because now the African firms or nascent firms, they are written out on the basis of access to financing, be it in the form of a state or in the form of firms, because the investment is so liberalized to achieve the objectives that Franklin talked about. Investment liberalization, government procurement issues, competition policies. Now, when you say government procurement policies or issues, immediately we are pushing the African countries to the consumption bow because the competition policy is going to tell the African countries they are not of quality and et cetera, et cetera. And our retail banking and with all others that are involved will avail financing on conditions that satisfy themselves to balance the equation of consumption and mass production that they had for us. Now the natives, if therefore we are trying to strike a deal out of the Pan-Africanism, we will have to rethink those things. Now, very few suggestions that I have critically is autarky. The then secretary of the Economic Commission of Africa within the United Nations, he talked of autarky at length, long time in the 80s, self-sustenance. Countries must strive to find ways of sustaining themselves. This is about to mobilize demand leading to the elimination of commercial risk, to the nascent industries and SMMEs. Now, this goes straight to the sovereign acquisition of funding or financing. Because if you have the competition policies there that are influenced by those who are involved in production, you're going to destroy all your nascent industries and SMEs. So we need to rethink those things. How do we sustain ourselves? As natives now, trying to be part of the program envisaged by Nkrumah and others that liberation or independence will be complete if Africa is developed. And to a point, therefore, we have an African unity. A model development, a model must create an environment that can nurture growth by entrepreneurs on the industrial layers of the identified sectors. Remember, when they financialize, they capture the whole value chain, provide money, you use our components, so we rely on the engineering workshop that is situated somewhere in Europe. Therefore, it doesn't spill over to the economy. So the natives have to structure themselves and find ways on how, therefore, we come up with a model that will create an environment that nurtures growth by entrepreneurs to the industrial layers of the identified sectors. Value chain drive. We have to drive an entrepreneurial program. We have to drive, be it so a state-owned, driven entrepreneurial or industrial program. Now, available leverage of policy directives through DFIs. I want to chat a bit about DFIs, Development Finance Institution, in the context of South Africa. We envisage, when we took over the country, we had an ambition of RDP. What is it? RDP. And this RDP came out, and it was to do all sorts of things. Now, it became a political rhetoric, like I already mentioned, that an ideology that is rhetoric, that doesn't have a vehicle for the developmental agenda. It carries on for years. I mean, Nkrumah says these things a long time, and others. We are still on this. So the DFIs in the context of South Africa were structured within the context of the economic capital that is derived from the structural adjustment program, from Washington consensus. As a result, it leads to financialization. The mandate of our development finance institutions, I know there might be some friends in some institutions as participants. They're very much aware that it's a mandate to an extent complicated compared to the actual official banks, because the advice that they got was that of, we have a mass production, you must create a mass consumption. So we need, therefore, to leverage, we must leverage on available policy directives through these DFIs and find ways on how then can we rework them or repurpose them to make distinction between funding and financing from both mega projects and facilitate demand to an extent that goes to the downstream industries to create spillovers that can champion real value chains in the economy. You can only do those things if you structure yourselves. So the approach or the idea of bringing in the concept of natives in the continent, it is not wrong, because it's a group of people that says we want to be part of the developmental project. We want to influence this project so that at least things are done in a way. I mean, I've been involved in discussions where we deal with the trade relations between African countries and the European countries, United States of America, recently China. And you times the accusations that there's an element of altruism where who create that? Because you'll find the European Union or European countries, when they come to the African continent, to the allies of state, so listen, we want to invest in your country. We have 1 billion rand, and our countries come and say, if you can give me 10 billion rand. Now it means they want to give you a hand, and our heads of state, they want to give the whole arm. So whose fault is that? So those are the things that we have to influence, so that we deal with the real devils, that is financialization and others. Now, competitive industries, we understand very well out of those economic partnership agreements leading us to that spaghetti power, there was an issue of competition. Those are the things that we have to challenge, because for us to create self-sustenance, to build our competitive industries, we have to have global value chains through a well-defined institutional model. So the natives are the things that they need to look at. Hello?
Only difference is, yes, whenever you're at certain places, your son gets preferred.
Can I continue?
Yes, you can continue. Sorry for that.
Yeah. So that's basically the conclusion. Now, Now, if I were to to conclude completely, the structure, a model I propose, we need a political platform for an industrial advancement. And that this platform has to deal with issues on how do we participate on the African Continental Free Trade Area, to deal with these really anomalies that we find in terms of how finance is flowing within the developing countries, particularly in the African continent. And if we were to achieve that, we need to rethink as to how our institutions are structured and how are built. They must resemble who we are. For us, I'm Bongani Mankewu, and if you are giving myself now to be John Williams, certainly the house that John Williams stays on, I would struggle to navigate. Sediko, I would think I will thank you from that note, and I'm very much keen to share thoughts and listen to the questions, all questions, so that we can advance the discussion. I apologize to take more of your time. Thank you very much, Sediko.
Thank you so much, Bongani. We really appreciate your presentation. And you've indicated that all African states are financialized. The states have abandoned their responsibility to control the economy, the market dictates. And in that case, the chances of self-sustaining are close to zero. We have opted to outsource the structuring of our society, and there are weaknesses in our institutions. And I can attest that I know of one NGO. It's not only happening in the economic sector, even in the social sector is happening. I know of one NGO that was funded by a donor from European Union countries. And one of the clauses that in that funding was that if that NGO wanted to buy, for example, sports equipment, they must buy products that are produced within European Union countries. So if you're given money, for instance, you're doing sports, you can't buy any equipment that is being produced in the country. You should buy the product that coming from those European countries. So that's what is happening when people are financing you and giving you the mandate that you use our money according to our own will. You purchase from our own country. And that's what Bongani was talking about. But without a waste of time, I'll then give colleagues chances to raise questions, inputs, and comments. I'll start by taking Dr. Ntabise Moleko. She has requested to go first. Therefore, I'll give a chance to go first.
Thank you. Thank you so much for the opportunity. And also thank you to Bongani for the presentation. I just want to really confirm some of the points he's made and concur that the only way that African economies can really get themselves in a place where they have investment-led growth through the primary and secondary sector. In fact, let me not even say, in fact, let me rephrase the investment, because I prefer to use domestic capitalization, because it may be ambiguous what I'm saying. So the use of your domestic mobilization of domestic resources towards industrialization, but also towards really consuming your own products. I think one of the important things that is mentioned, and I concur, is that if we are supposed to and going to change really the African economic story in terms of the future, if we don't understand that, if we must simplify this thing, how much of your disposable income do you spend on food products, on the value chain of food? Most of the poorer household, they spend up to 60% of their household income on food. But then you have to ask the question, of that proportion of income spent on food, how much of that food is owned and the value chain is owned by locals? And those locals, who are those locals? Is it commercial conglomerates, or is it actually owned by SMMEs, and particularly in South Africa, it would be Black-owned SMMEs? And you'll find that most of our value chains for food comes from imports. And if you look at the way that the oligopolies and mainly most of our economies control most of the food production alone, there's very little space for any new entrants to come in, one. And he's correct to say that the financialization and the use of finance in South Africa, particularly, if you look at the trail of capital, it hasn't been reinvested into new entrants, primarily Black entrants, but also into your industry or what we call productive capacity or capability. Therefore, we are stuck with what we call a services-led growth. And we are not industrializing, we're not creating new industries, we're not able to benefit, even if there's liberalization. This liberalization benefits those who already have access to the markets, but it doesn't benefit new entrants because they talk about what they say it's competitiveness. But you've never had a chance to even enter the game. How can you build competitiveness? You therefore need to build from scratch and be given an opportunity to actually trade and engage. So I think that we've got to look at three critical things. We've got to industrialize and make sure that we look at agri-processing and the food production value chain, improve new Black entrants in South Africa, but also into the continent, but make sure that continentally, for us to benefit from this free trade area and the liberalization continentally, we have got to see more Black entrants and owners of these products. Until we see that, it is unlikely that we will see the gains from this African free trade arrangement. I think the second thing is that the capital must be disciplined. We've got to discipline capital. The issue of the credit and particularly the financial markets being so risk averse to not reinvest into particularly Black owned SMMEs, and the risk that they put and price at such a high price that it becomes even non-competitive to go to them. The DFIs must deal with that market failure. But two, we must deal with the issue of capital flows that disinvest and rather than invest into the capital or the productive sectors of the South African economy. And there's a lot of data that can show and prove that there hasn't been really increase in what we call gross fixed capital formation. I think the third point that I want to make is that we have got to understand the buying power that the continent has. Black people on this continent have massive buying power. South African, the emerging market, the consumers are large. If you look at the retailers that have grown, it's because they've gone into the Black market, they've gone into the townships, they've expanded their growth into the African economy. You look at the ShopRite holdings, you look at the Pick n Pay, Woolworths, they're all going into the African market. And you look at their share price, their earnings, their returns, they understand the profits there are there in the Black buying power. The question is, do we understand it? Are we equipping and enabling Black or new entrants to be able to capitalize from this free trade area with finance, with there's necessary trade finance support, there's credit insurance that must be provided, and all sorts of other technical support that is required, particularly for new owners and new entrants. And I think it's an opportunity for us. But if we don't understand that these value chains are controlled by oligopolies, and we must use the laws to ensure that there's new entrants to break oligopolies, we are not going to see changes in the outcomes. Instead, we'll see the conglomerates still going to take all the gains. We'll see the multinationals going to take all the gains in Africa, and we'll be watching. And yet we've said there's a continental free trade, and the beneficiaries of those are those who already are beneficiaries of the current status quo. And so this is what we need to change. And Rakoloti, I just want to share that so a lot of this I've written in a report that I've written called New Wine into New Wine Skin. It's available online, and I think you can provide it to the participants. But I think that many of the points Bongani makes, we elaborate in that. And I think that we really need to change the growth trajectory from a services-led type of growth, which we have been almost blinded to believe is the way for us to grow. So we must continue to import everything from everywhere. And most countries that grew and are industrialized now, that are economic powers, they understand the basics. Grow your own products, be able to feed your own people, make sure that that is local owned, because if we don't own the food value chain, we can't feed our own people and we rely on imports. We're enriching out of our own pockets. Every day you go to Pick n Pay, Woolworths, all those products you're buying into your home, they are going to other people from other countries and not locals and not our people. So we need to change these things. Thank you so much for this amazing webinar.
Thank you so much, Dr. Muleko. Colleagues, other colleagues who want to make some input? Other colleagues who want to make some input? Colleagues who want to make inputs, raise up your hands and comment. while you are still thinking about making inputs, any comment from Bongani from the submission from Dr. Moleko?
Yeah, Dr. Malebo is very correct. He calls it service-led growth. Surely is the same as a finance-led development. So those are the things that we really we have to try and find ways. I think that's basically what happened. The finance-led development. What you're talking about is you have the finance sector that dictates the growth of a development, but you don't own the finance. You are unlikely to achieve industrialization. So therefore, we need to square it up differently. We say the finance sector supposed to grow when entrepreneurs emerge. So meaning which it should be a development lead finance, not the other way around. So those are the things I think that I think she's very much on point. I fully agree with you. I fully agree with her. I think there's a hand there, Sediko.
Okay.
I was just going to say, well spoken to my sister, because this is the absolute truth, and we need not talk, but we need to do. We always come up with the things that we know that are wrong, but we need to actually start managing campaigns around how we spend our money in our communities, and we need to be very vocal about it, whether we come on YouTube videos and talk about it, but we need a consistent campaign that constantly talks about how we are putting our money out in other people's communities and making them rich while our children are hungry and suffering.
Okay. Thank you so much for your input. And one of the things that we are doing from our institute is to organize this type of webinars where we can engage and conscientize the unconscious. So you are right to say, let's put this on YouTube, let's mobilize our communities through various social media platforms and other means so that we can start conscientizing them. Thank you so much for your input.
But also, you need to just have a major central campaign that makes sure that everybody else is doing that. You know what I'm saying? Because you might go on YouTube and say, okay, this is what we need to do, but you don't have any body taking responsibility to make sure that it's actually going on, that it's actually training going on into our homes and our businesses and our organizations.
We fully agree with you. We fully agree with you on that. Any other inputs from other colleagues?
While you're trying to get other colleagues, Akina is correct. But what we have to bear in mind is the big spender under consumption is the state. And now we have two categories here around the issue of savings and credit. You have the household credit that inflate unreasonable. Of course, that's the consumption by individual household. So it puts all the citizens in a position of bad credit. But we have the state now in the African continent, for example. We grasp everything that comes to an extent that South Africa recently is sitting at, I think, just over 60% ratio debt to GDP, because the state borrows recklessly. The state borrows recklessly to a point that it gets down to even the retail banks, that they lend recklessly to the households. So these campaigns must be solidified to look at what exactly is the situation, because when the state spend recklessly, particularly in areas of with the attempts for industrialization, building mega infrastructure projects, etc., who takes the money home? Mainly is creditors. So if you go further on the scholarly point of view, you have things like agency theory, etc., etc. You know, there are a lot of things, there are conflicts, etc., where our state borrows recklessly, and that thing comes down to the citizens. So far, the significant role that we've played within the project of democracy, that we've played significantly, is that of consumption. So those are the things that we have to deal with at the higher level and at the household level. Thanks, Sediko.
Thank you so much. I can see that colleagues don't have any inputs. Let me check There's an input here from Nelly. Is there, however, any political will on the part of African governments to create an enabling environment for Africans to industrialize and eventually grow our food, for example? Is there any political will for African governments? That's the question. Bongani, do you see any will from do you see any political will from African governments?
Yeah, on the status quo, like I've said, it's a balance of mass production relative to mass consumption, of which the democratic project is to sustain the welfare of individuals. Now, if you outsource the services that are supposed to be performed by government to the private sector, you are likely, therefore, then to feed to the capitalist project. So the current political elite in the continent is within that thinking that it is democracy that is supported by, from the view of a capitalist understanding that brings its own production. So the current elite, I want to assure you, it doesn't know what it's doing as far as the development is concerned in the African continent. The answer is there is no political will as things stand, even with the opposition parties.
Thank you, Bongani. In the absence of political will, what should the natives do to ensure that, because there is no political will, and it means if there's no political will, we'll remain with the status quo going forward for years and years and years. What should then the natives do where there's no political will?
I am saying a political platform and industrial advancement that will deal with all these things from a savings credit point of view to address the actual mass production relative to mass consumption, so that we conscientize our people on a pragmatist basis.
Thank you, Bongani. Any last inputs, comments from colleagues before we close? Any inputs, questions from colleagues before we close? I think most of the comments that I'm getting from other social media platforms is just to appreciate your presentation, and most of the people are saying we need to share this presentation. So colleagues, those who want us to share the presentation from Bongani, please leave your email address in the chat box so that we can send the presentation to you. Dr. Moleko has shared a study. She has uploaded a study on the chat box also. You can download that study. If you want the presentation from Bongani, please leave your email address so that we can send the presentation to you. Without a waste of time, thank you so much, Bongani. Thank you so much to participants. We really appreciate your participation and your preparation to this topic, Bongani. We're looking forward to continue engaging on this type of topics. We really appreciate, and we're looking forward to mobilize society using our education platform. Our intention is to raise consciousness so that all of us will be conscious on various topics. And this one of economy is a topic that is closer to our hearts, because if you don't have an economic power, political power becomes useless. And you can't have a social power if you don't have economic power, according to the presentation given by Bongani. But before we close, there is a Sipati Masobela. The hand is up, Sipati, you can come in. Your microphone is can you unmute?
Oh, good afternoon, good evening, colleagues. Thank you so much for this webinar. I was just invited by one of the students. I'm just a student doing a research, doing my last module on this topic, but I'm talking about the impact it has on the intra-Africa trade. So I'm so glad to see that there are groups that are existing that are engaging and looking at this continental free trade area, which my view on my research is also in a negative way, because I'm looking at all the gaps that is in the agreement as well as the previous trade agreements. So I'm so glad that there is discussions going around. And I just want to thank you for the knowledge that I've gained today. And I would wish that in future, if it happens that you discussing there's this discussion that is going on, it's gonna assist us because being in a house and just depending on articles and not seeing the actual people talking about things, it's better if we talk like this, because that's when now we learn from each other and we can even see other views on the topic. So thank you so much. I've just sent my email for any invites in the future, and as well as whatever information that we have to share with us, so that we'll be able to prepare and come with some comments and input. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Sipati.
Thanks, Sipati. Sediko, sorry, man. Sipati, you correct, there are gaps, of course. I've highlighted that. There are studies, for example, in Nigeria, the skeptic on the basis of the loss on the tariff revenue is going to push them to a comprehensive consumer tax system. I'm not too sure in South Africa how they structure themselves. So there are a lot of gaps because we're liberalizing tariffs. However, the value chain is not strong and the countries differ. So, but what I'm putting as a proposition is it is an instrument, essentially. However, how we take it further, it's upon ourselves. So I'm very pleased. I'm sure as you carry on with your module, you will probably advance to a thesis topic for a PhD to continue advancing this discussion so that people like you can even write books around these things. And we look at all those aspects, the foreign direct investment impact on our countries, the foreign portfolio investment impact on our countries, the export-import relations between the European, America and China, how they are structured. Because this is an issue like South Africa. I'll give you an example. The revenue that Nigeria, whoever scholar in Nigeria argues. In South Africa, when we joined the World Trade Organization, we're sitting at a high level in terms of charging tariffs. That made sense. That created spillovers to the downstream industries. But to date, I think we moved from 28% of tariffs. We moved slightly down to 15%. We're sitting at 8.2. So we have tariffs that are so low. Now South Africa has to engage on the Africa Continental Free Trade Area with the 8.2 tariffs to the European countries. How are you going to build value chains for the manufacturing sector of South Africa? So the only thing that you will achieve is to have outlets from the European countries in the form of agents. Now, agents are in the form of fronting in Black economic empowerment. Fronting in Black economic empowerment doesn't create wealth. It perpetuates rent seeking. So they consume the wealth that is already created. Now the Black economic empowerment partners, all they bring to the market is the state. So yes, it is a discussion that we need. It doesn't necessarily mean when we go to how we repurpose it is always accurate for all countries. Like I referred to, now if you are going to go to a point of creating a comprehensive consumer tax like we're doing in South Africa, we mess up the ESCOM condition. Now we have to raise tariffs to the citizens. Same goes with all the organizations that live or that survive on tariffs. Every now and again, when the mess happens, it goes to the citizens. So those are the things that we have to look at and engage amongst ourselves on such matters to a point where we get to a point where we're really organized. I thank you, Sediko.
Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Sipati and Nelly and others and Sharif. Without a waste of time, I think we have come to the end of our session. This was the last session for the year. We have been holding this type of sessions. We'll resume in January. We're taking a break from our side. We have been holding these sessions since March. We'll take a break from our side.